Today we're going to talk about the evolution of, or I guess, how it is that evolutionary biology makes sense of this phenomenon of homosexuality, mainly sexual orientation. And this is a question that I get asked a lot. I want to start by just talking about homosexuality or homosexual behavior in other organisms. Like, how common is? I guess there is a difference between homosexual behavior and then actual like homosexual orientation. I don't know if we can tease that apart in animals, but I guess just what is the research in other animals around homosexuality?
Right. That's a really big question. So like we can only maybe sketch out a few relatively summary pictures of what that looks like. But um so in the research literature there's been estimates that have ranged, in the upwards of 1,000. I mean, like I've you see the number a lot in the research literature that as many as like 1,500, give or take, animal species have been, observed to have uh, engaged in some sort of same-sex behavior.
Mm.
And you mentioned the question of like, can you tease apart like homosexuality as the orientation versus like same-sex behavior more broadly. And so it's a little bit difficult in some cases. Like, we can't get inside, the head of other species if we can't really communicate that with them using, our own, human languages.
Yeah.
But that being said, though, there are some species that practice monogamous mating, and there's a number of species where it's been observed that there are, um, on one hand, you could say like same-sex behavior as just like a behavior that animals, will sometimes engage in, and it doesn't really mean anything in terms of like what we would think of as being like having a sexual orientation. But in other contexts, you can also see instances where organisms seem to engage in same-sex behavior, preferentially, or like, they're more likely to, or they do so more often. And then I'll go again, I'm speaking like to like specific instances. Like it's not, I don't think there's any species where like, everyone's homosexual,
Hmm.
but there are at least, you can look at behavioral trends or behavioral patterns and say, okay, some members of this species are, more prone to same-sex behavior than they are prone to opposite-sex behavior. And I would say that is something more akin to what we would recognize amongst ourselves as being like homosexual. There are, some species, for example, that engage in same-sex pair bonding, and that's much more than just like quick little in the moment same-sex behavior.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's
but that really varies by species. Sorry,
right.
go ahead.
When I was at so I used to volunteer at zoos. That's actually kind of how I got into science education. Is I started out volunteering at zoos, and I lived in Tennessee for a while, and I was volunteering at the Knoxville Zoo, and
Okay.
we had a there was a couple of owls there that there were two males that pair bonded, and they were really close. I mean, they had. I'm actually not sure in that case if it was if they were alone there together and that's why they pair bonded, or if I seem to remember that there were females to choose from, but that the males pair bonded and they would build a nest, they would guard their nest, they wouldn't interact with other owls very much, and we were actually not supposed to tell people about that unless they asked because
Hmm.
it caused like people didn't like it if you were telling their kids that the owls were both male. So I thought that was interesting. People were very uncomfortable about that. And I know that this happens a lot in captivity with birds, especially. Birds will pair bond, and a lot of bird species pair bond for life. Uh, I just had to mute myself earlier here because my dogs were barking, and my dogs are actually really interesting because I have a female dog and a male dog. The My male dog does something that I try to look in the literature to see if anyone's documented this before because I filmed it. I'll have to put up a film of this sometime because it's super interesting. He is fixed She is not. We got her from a breeder. She was being used to breed dogs, and she was older, and so we're like, we just won't bother fixing her. We'll just deal with her being in heat every once in a while. Well, we take them to the
Mhm.
dog park a lot, but obviously not when she's in heat. That would be a problem. But when she's in heat, they will mate. He's fixed, so there's no chance of her getting pregnant, but they'll mate. And when he's been mating with her, he is extremely jealous. He does typical mate guarding behaviors, which are well documented in dogs, where they'll when the female urinates, the male will urinate over her urine. He if you pick up our Zoe, our female dog, and you put her back down,
Mhm.
he'll go sniff and make sure that she didn't just like mate with someone. I mean, he's just on top of it. After she's out of heat and we can start taking her to the dog park again, he is extremely jealous still for it probably lasts about 2 months. And what he does for mate guarding, if a male shows interest in him, he will go present as a female and he'll bump against them and start getting them to try and copulate with him. It's like it seems like this is like I think most biologists, if they were to see that in the wild, they would document that as homosexual behavior. But in the context, it seems like it's a form of mate guarding. It's really interesting. So I've not seen anyone document that. It's not in the literature anywhere, but that's what my dog does. It appears to be a form of mate guarding. So I'm really curious to hear if anyone has ever seen that elsewhere. Uh, but
Yeah.
I'll have to upload a video of it because it's really obvious what's happening when you watch
Mm.
it, and it makes people at the dog park uncomfortable, and it's just kind of a funny situation. But the
Yeah, that's actually proposed as one of the possible hypotheses to explain same-sex behavior, at least in some animals. The
yeah
That would be the example of intrasexual conflict, like conflict between males, for example.
yeah
Like you said, the idea being, you know, individuals might, reduce the reproductive success of competitors
right.
through same-sex behavior.
And that would be an adaptive explanation for homosexual behavior.
Hmm.
But we don't necessarily need an adaptive explanation for it. There are other hypotheses as we're going to go over here for for homosexual orientation. Uh, so you're saying that this is observed in thousands of animals, the homosexual behavior at least, and then we have in individuals we have every once in a while you'll get long-term same-sex pair bonding. So either two females or two males. Um,
Right.
are there? You said that there are some species where it's more prominent than others. Uh, which species specifically are you mentioning there?
Well, the ones that come to mind most easily for me would be birds, right? Because like
Yeah,
there's social monogamy, monogamous pair bonding is really common in birds. And actually, there's different kinds of monogamy, right? There's social monogamy where you might have a pair bond just between two adults that stay together throughout their lifespan,
yeah,
and that you would call social monogamy. And that's actually technically distinct from sexual monogamy. And so, like, there's a lot of examples of birds that are socially monogamous, but they're not sexually monogamous.
yeah,
And so that would be, I guess, you could almost think of that as like in human language, it'd be almost like having an open relationship, I guess.
right,
But well, I hesitate to anthropomorphize birds, but there is a distinction between like social and sexual monogamy.
yeah,
And yeah, so those would be, I think, some of my favorite examples. In fact, the Quaker parrot, it's the little green bird that's on my shoulder in my Twitter profile
yeah, yeah,
picture. Um, that species is known for being socially monogamous and also engages in mate guarding. Like my Quaker parrot hates my romantic partner.
Yeah.
And well, I don't know if hates is the right word, but just is a lot
Right.
more aggressive and is a
Yeah.
lot more like um, possessive of me, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And but this bird species is also known to engage in what we would call extra pair paternity,
Right.
right? So like, um, you know how the cuckoo bird is kind of parasitic in the sense that it can like it'll tend to lay an egg in the nest of some other species and then have the birds of that other species raise its own young.
Yeah.
Uh, well, the Quaker parrot it has been reported as in the literature as doing that to other members of its own species, where
Yeah.
it'll just engage in extra pair paternity and drop its young off to be raised by some other members of the same species.
Yeah.
So there's I guess sorry, I'm getting off on a tangent, but I guess my point being like there's a lot of monogamous pair bonding that occurs in animals, and I think at least I'm more familiar with birds than I am with a lot of other taxonomic lineages. So my answer might be a little bit biased in terms of like the degree of representation among taxa, but yeah, there's species that um, there's quite a lot of species actually that engage in monogamous pair bonding.
Yeah.
Uh, I believe cetaceans, which are whales and dolphins, also do as well,
Yeah.
quite commonly. And of course, that sexual same-sex behaviors observed quite frequently in cetaceans as well.
Hmm. Yeah. What in dogs and in wolves, the one of the reasons that mate guarding is so common in dogs and in wolves is because the males will feed the female. I'm not sure if they. I, I think in wolves they also feed the pups, but for sure they feed the female when she's nursing. So it's a huge personal investment for the male in the offspring. And so
Right. Yeah.
you can think of how mate guarding would evolve is just the males don't that don't mate guard are oftentimes going to be raising puppies that are not theirs, and so their genes aren't going to be passed on. And males that do mate guard are more likely to be actually be raising their own puppies, so their that trait of mate guarding will get passed on. So you can get the evolution of mate guarding instincts that dogs still show. Um,
Yeah.
that's interesting. So you're saying that the Quaker parrot. I actually had a sun conure parrot for a while, and
Oh, cool.
he was the same. He was very aggressive. Actually, it was kind of seasonal. It depended on the season, because they have, they go through like a mating season, and he was male, and in males in sun conure parrots, their hormones completely change when they're during mating season, and not in mating season. Their testicles shrink. Everything like shuts down, which I don't know, maybe that's like a weight saving adaptation since birds have to fly so much. But that's what it was described to as me. But he would, at certain times of the year, he'd become super aggressive towards anyone who was not me. But I have an identical twin brother, and so he would hang out with both of us just fine. He'd just fly back and forth and be kind of confused. He would think that my brother is me, and that was the only person he could get along with when he was, I guess you'd say, in heat. But yeah, that is interesting. The the mate guarding in parrots. I guess that must be an adaptation for, like what you were saying before. It must be common in many species of parrots then um, for males to spend resources raising babies that aren't theirs, which is that's what would get that's what would drive mate guarding to evolve. Yeah. Uh, and then so that's as far as pair bonding goes, and so you can get social monogamy, you can get same sex social monogamy as you were saying, um, but would you say that's less common than male female social monogamy in birds?
Uh, Same-sex pair bonding is less common in birds. Yeah, I would definitely
Yeah.
say so.
Um, and then we have there are some animals that just do a lot of homosexual behaviors. I know hyenas are one example where the females there's a lot of uh, female sexual activity in hyenas. You have giraffes behind you in the picture behind you there. I seem to remember hearing that there's a lot of male sexual activity with giraffes. I don't know if you've looked into that, but
Yeah, though, I mean, that wouldn't surprise me. I couldn't say off the top of my head whether what the evidence is for giraffes, but I mean, you're absolutely right. Like this is observed in so many species, like fish and echinoderms, starfish and sea urchins and squids, and not that squids are echinoderms, they're cephalopods, but there's
Yeah.
a whole bunch of different taxa of marine life, and then as well as insects and reptiles, birds, different species of mammal. It's been observed pretty much across the gamut uh, of animal taxa, same-sex behavior, that is.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about it in humans now.
Sure.
And by the way, if anyone has questions, feel free to put those questions in the comments here. We'll get to questions later on. But let's talk about homosexuality in humans. Again, there's going to be homosexual behavior and then homosexual pair bonding in humans, or I guess, you know, it's considered homosexual orientation, right? Maybe I guess
Right.
maybe we should talk about the difference between homosexual orientation and homosexual behavior in humans. Maybe that would be a good spot to start.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the simplest way to think of it is just that the homosexual orientation refers to like who you're attracted to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's in a way it kind of precedes behavior, like in the sense that people tend to gravitate when it comes to sexual behavior, people tend to gravitate towards people they're attracted to, right? So like you can conceptually draw a line of distinction between behavior and orientation, but um, they're frequently related, at least in humans, because I think almost all cultures are have a general norm of um, you know tending to I guess try to pursue relationships with people they're attracted to, right? So
Yeah, yeah. Well, we have like situational homosexuality in prison systems, for example, and that might actually be what happens a lot of times in zoos when you see animals doing same-sex pair bonding too. Is uh, a lot of times prisoners who are engaged even in long-term homosexual relationships, they'll say that they're not homosexual, so that they've formed this bond because that's the only option available to them. Uh, and a lot of older like with in America in the United States. I mean, my uncle was in this situation. He got married to a woman. He was gay. He was only attracted to men, but he got married to a woman because it was so unacceptable at the time. So you have, in that case, I guess, situational heterosexuality, where he fathered a child, but it was just very difficult for him. And I mean, if you talk to people in the prison situation where they're in the opposite situation, it's very difficult for them. So there's I would say that in those cases, yeah, there's a difference between the uh, yeah, stark difference between behavior and orientation, right? Um,
right, yeah, I wouldn't generalize to a sorry, I wouldn't generalize from a confining situation like being in prison to
yeah,
human behavior more broadly. That's for sure.
yeah. Uh, how common is homosexual orientation in humans? Do we have a good idea of that? And I guess also how intense. I know that there's a scale that was it the Keensley scale that
The
I was
Kinsey scale.
the Kinsey scale that I was reading about. So
Yeah.
which is where people are rated on a whole number of questions on their sexual orientation. So am I getting that right? Because I'm new to this research. I was just kind of like crash course before we had this meeting, but so that's a scale from 0 to 6, 0 being fully heterosexual, 6 being fully homosexual. And the
Right.
the article I was reading about it showed that men are typically either zeros or sixes. Um, a smaller percentage are obviously a majority of men are zeros, like zero through 3, and then you have quite a few. I think it was like 10% is the study that I was reading of men that are six, so they're fully homosexual. And then with women, things were a little bit more. There was a little bit more margins, so there was a little bit more fluidity for women in the article that I was reading. I don't know if that's like consistent in studies that have been done.
Yeah, so there's one study by I hope I'm not mispronouncing this, but I might be Kazi Rahman
Mm-hmm.
uh, and colleagues. And by the way, I'm happy to send the a lot of the literature to you, like some papers that I might reference during this conversation. I'm happy to share with you if you
Oh,
wanted
great.
to
Yeah.
like post them under this video or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I'll put links in the video description.
okay, great. But yeah, there was a study just a couple years ago in the journal Archives of Sexual Behavior where they looked at the prevalence of sexual orientation across, dozens of countries in, North America, Europe, Asia, the Pacific Islands, just pretty much across the world. Except I don't think they looked in Africa. Um, but they found that pretty much across the board, the prevalence of homosexuality, then the people who like report being, gay or lesbian,
Orientation.
as
Yeah.
opposed to right, is generally tends to be, in the low to mid, well, yeah, mid single digits. Like I think it was almost always somewhere between like 3 and 11%.
Okay.
And then it's I mean, it varies by country, but on average, it's slightly higher for people that report being bisexual. And then, of course, the majority remaining
Mm-hmm.
is people who report being straight. But I think the interesting thing about this type of research is that it kind of parallels what we see in the sense of same-sex behavior in animals, where we see it exists at relatively low, but nevertheless kind of universal prevalence across different taxa.
Mm-hmm.
And then like also if you zoom in on humans, even across different cultures around the world, we still see it at it's a minority, but it's still a very widely prevalent uh, uh, phenomenon, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
That people are people India, the Philippines, almost every country we've looked at, we see a low but nevertheless persistent minority of people who are gay and bisexual.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like when people ask me questions about is there a gay gene, what they're trying to get at is they're trying to ask, is homosexuality natural? And um the just the fact that we see this cross cultural is a huge indication that yes, it is. Even before we had any of the research, and then of course you could just ask someone, like, is this natural or is this your choice, and they can tell you. But and that was actually one of the responses that I would give to people in the past was like, well, if you ask people, they'll tell you that it's natural for them. So I don't see any reason not to believe them. But a lot of people do want this extra evidence. They want this genetic evidence before they're willing to accept it. Which I don't know. It just where we're at in our country. I feel like things are a lot more accepting nowadays than they were for my uncle. But of course, there's still a lot of people who are very uncomfortable with homosexuality and are trying to still having trouble accepting that it's even could be possibly real. Uh,
Yeah, things have gotten better for the LGBTQ community relative to where we were, generations ago, like you say, but we still have a long way to go.
yeah, in Western community, Western.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Philippines. It's how is homosexuality accepted more in other cultures than it is here? Like,
I would definitely say, well, I guess it depends on what you mean by here, but because like uh, I think like whether or not we would view the West as being like culturally homogenous or like a bunch of different cultures, I think kind of varies by like what's the context of what we're talking about. But like,
yeah,
um, the United States tends to be a lot more of an individualistic culture, for example, than let's say Europe. So like in some respects, um, you know, Western Europe is culturally different than North America, even though we would both consider them to be like the West.
Yeah.
And so, like in that respect, you know, homosexuality historically tends to be more accepted in places that are more left-leaning politically in other ways.
Hmm.
You know, like in ways that are topically like different, independent sexual orientation.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So, and then of course there have been uh, instances where, or, well, there's this idea that like, okay, so I'm not a historian of India, but my um, limited understanding is that there's this hypothesis that sexual orientation or that homosexuality is largely viewed negatively there, um, partly because of the influence of British colonialization. Like if you go
Yes.
back to
Yeah.
like ancient India, then homosexuality is understood to have been more accepted than following colonialization.
Yeah. That's. I was reading about that in different African colonies as well. That there was it was way more accepted in the past. Yeah. That's such an
Yeah.
unfortunate consequence of all this. Um,
Right. Yeah.
uh, well, let's talk about the evolutionary explanation. So we have the observations that we have here is that homosexual behavior is common in mammals, is common in birds. Uh, Long-term homosexual pair bonding is, when I say common, I mean it exists. It's always a low percentage, but it exists. We see that in animals that do pair bonding, so birds and so on. In humans, we're at, you said, between 3 and 10% is where things tend to shake out in these surveys.
Yeah, I mean, you get like a distribution, but that seems to be where most countries fall that have been looked at.
Yeah, and these are through multiple questions to try and break through, people not being comfortable talking about it and so on. So yeah, between
Right.
3 and 10%. That, I mean, that's very consistent. So
Mhm.
what that suggests is that there must be some sort of a genetic component to this. And
Right.
if that's the case, the question is, why does natural selection not select against this until it does not exist in a population? And so there are multiple different hypotheses for that. That, without looking at the data, like what are the different explanations for this that we could hypothesize about?
Right. So there's actually, I mean, there's like over a dozen different proposed explanations
Yeah.
for the existence of same-sex behavior and homosexuality. You know, if you were to group those together, there's over a dozen different explanations that have been proposed. The most likely, uh, the most likely thing is that we probably need multiple different hypotheses to be true in order to be able to account for all the data we see, because
Hmm.
you know, various phenomena might have different explanations depending on the context or depending on the situation, depending on the species, for example, and the culture. That being said, though, like to give you one example, it's it's been uh, well, so one observation that's been reproducibly seen and reported in the literature by different studies is that uh, in the case of gay men, and unfortunately, homosexuality in males has been looked at a lot more than homosexuality in women, and so that's actually kind of a area, like I guess you could say, like that, like a hole in the research where uh, we need more data to fill it. But um, although there are some exceptions to that, I'm happy to talk about some studies that have looked at homosexuality in women. But if we start with the case of like homosexuality in men, one finding that's been reproducibly reported in the literature is that gay men, on average, have more older brothers than straight men. And again, this varies by from person to person. These are like statistical averages across the population. So of
Yeah.
course there are going to be people that are straight, but they have a ton of older brothers, and there might be people who are an only child and they're gay. But
Yeah.
statistically, and the one of the explanations for this is called the fraternal birth order effect, and the idea is that the more times a woman is pregnant with a male fetus, over time, it cumulatively increases the likelihood that the next son she has somewhere down the line is going to end up being gay.
Hmm.
And that would be an example of uh, that tends to be explained more in terms of like a hormonal explanation rather than something that's genetically inherited from our distant ancestors. Uh,
Right.
and
Or,
then on a more, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
or I guess that would be like it's the genetics of the mother, not the genetics of not the actual genome of the gay male in that circumstance. It would be there's something in the mother's genes that's causing her to, I guess, change the environment of her body to that would induce uh, homosexuality in one of her sons.
Right. Yeah. So when that was when this finding was first, I guess, starting to be something that people were taking notice of, like in a sexual orientation research, uh, it was uh, basically proposed that it was a result of the mother's immune system basically reacting to the presence of the Y chromosome in her
Ah,
uterus,
interesting.
and or something on the Y chromosome, like a Y-linked histocompatibility complex, they call it. And and so there's other examples where over time successive uh, exposures to something can strengthen the immune response to the thing that you're being exposed to. And so it's thought that perhaps this is something that can help explain the increase, the progressively increasing likelihood with successive pregnancies that the next male son is going to be gay. There is actually, ironically, a potential evolutionary explanation for that, although I think the data is very limited, if there even is any data at all. But one possible evolutionary angle to that is that um, you could maybe take a step back and say that as the family grows, the sorry, let me back up. If we were to assume, for the sake of argument, that like being gay is a proxy for having a reduced likelihood of being reproductive,
Yeah,
or being reproductively active,
because
then
that's
you
not
could
necessarily
say
the case.
that
Yeah,
it's not necessarily the case, but let's just assume that for the sake of
yeah.
argument. Then you could say that as family size increases, the so does the likelihood. The likelihood also increases that uh, later sons further down the chain are going to be um, uh, less reproductively active. And
Hmm.
so you could imagine well, it's pretty easy to piece together what could be a potential adaptive significance of that, right? Like as
Hmm.
family size grows, the number of mouths to feed also grows, and the number of individuals that are potentially going to be also reproducing in the next generation also grows. And so one way to perhaps, uh, you know, I guess, uh, I I don't like to use like Malthusian language
Yeah.
because it's like really really outdated. Um, but to the extent that it produces a burden on the family to try to care for not only the offspring but the next generation of offspring subsequent to that, then it is potentially adaptively significant to have some members of the extended family be non-reproductively active so that they can care for others. And this gets back to like the kin selection hypothesis.
Yeah.
But again, this is like really speculative, right? Like I don't even know if there's any data at all to support that there's an evolutionary component to the fraternal birth order effect. I only bring up the fraternal birth order effect actually to say that there are proposed explanations for male homosexuality that don't seem to have any genetic basis per se.
Right.
And
Right.
uh,
Okay. So,
that, yeah,
so oh, well, let's try and summarize that then. So, instead of trying to think of homosexuality as an adaptation, you could just think of it as an effect of the mother's immune system in this case, right? Um,
right,
or you could also think of it as a an adaptation under kin selection, where you've got uh, homosexuality as a trait that allows for members of the family to, instead of reproducing, help out with other tasks of child rearing and helping take care of the family. that have nothing to do with reproduction. And this is something that we see in lots of animals, that like crows, for example. The siblings will stay in the nest for sometimes several years and help the mother take care of children. So they will postpone being reproductively active even when it's physically possible for them to. They just behaviorally that they won't do it, and instead they help the mother. You see this in lots of different dog species actually too. There's the African dog will do that. They'll wolves will do that. It's forced. So the alpha female, or the female who's, when times are tough, she won't let the other females in the pack get pregnant, so she'll stop a mating from happening. So you see, this is common in nature, kin selection,
Right.
doing
Yeah.
this. Bees are the obvious example. The bees don't
Yeah.
have,
Bees and ants.
yeah.
Yeah.
But you're saying there's not good data for kin selection being the cause of homosexuality. So uh, there's not.
Well, sorry, just to clarify, what I mean is kin selection being the cause of the fraternal birth order effect.
Okay. Okay. All right.
That's the thing that I don't think has really been looked at much. At least I'm not familiar with any papers that have really looked at that in any depth.
Yeah.
Um,
A
there,
cleaner.
there, there have been papers that have looked at kin selection more broadly as a proposed contributing explanation. Not that it's exhaustive, but as a potential contributor to homosexuality, at least in some contexts.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you're saying that the birth order thing, it's cleaner to explain this as a reaction of the immune system, because that's the data that we have. Okay.
Yeah, basically, yeah. And I think that's the fraternal birth order effect, and like how mixed the data is in terms of like kin selection being a contributor toward explaining homosexuality, I think is a good opportunity to kind of highlight the fact that like, is there a gay gene is kind of a big oversimplification, right? Like the
Yeah.
idea that something is genetic doesn't mean that genetic determinism is true, right? Like
Yeah.
our genes are a biological organism is a really dynamic system, right? Like, and our genes are constantly interacting with their environment, and so the whole, I mean, even the whole idea of like nature versus nurture is kind of a false dichotomy. Like, you have this interaction between our environment that we grow up in and the genes that we inherit, and it's the consequence of that interaction that shapes who we are, and including our sexual orientation.
Yeah.
And so, like, it's probably never going to be discovered that there is actually a gay gene, but that doesn't mean that homosexuality isn't still genetic, because genetics does play a role. It's just not the complete picture of the story.
Right. Right. Well, and in this case, it would be an unrelated set of genes, the genes of the mother's immune system that have evolved for completely different reasons that might be causing homosexuality in this case. That's really interesting. So
Right.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, homosexuality caused by epigenetic factors, epigenetic for the actual child, genetic for the mother. Yeah.
But then there, at the same time, there have been, I mean, there is a lot of evidence that has shown that that there are very clearly genetic components. And in fact, I didn't even really, in that original thread that you mentioned on Twitter, I didn't, like, I purposefully excluded talking about the fraternal birth order effect, specifically
Hmm.
because the point of that thread was to focus on like that question of why would homosexuality be like so prevalent, and why would it be able to um, evade extinction, right?
Yeah.
If gay people are less likely to have kids. And so I was more focusing on like, what's the research say about the evolutionary components? And so that kind of excluded talking about the fraternal birth order effect or other potential explanations for homosexuality.
Hmm.
But there is that being said, though, like there is really good evidence that it is genetic. Like, not only have there been twin studies where you can compare the statistical likelihood that both twins have the same sexual orientation if they're fraternal twins versus if they're identical twins,
Yeah.
right? And so the if one twin is gay, for example, the other twin is more likely to be gay if they're identical twins than if they're fraternal twins. And so that's one way to show that, okay, there does seem to be some evidence for a genetic component.
Yeah.
And I would say even stronger than that is the evidence from genome-wide association studies. And I can talk a little bit about what those are if you would like, but suffice it to say that we see uh, some ways that the DNA sequence varies from person to person in the population, and the
Hmm.
way that it varies from person to person is statistically correlated with sexual orientation, and that's
Yeah.
another source of evidence that sexual orientation has a genetic component.
Right. And in that case, it's not necessarily a single gene, like a single stretch that you could find on one chromosome, but multiple interactions from multiple genes. And we'll talk about that in a second here. But before we move on from the fraternal birth order effect, um,
Mhm.
I've got a question just to re-explain what that means. You explained it once, but maybe we went over it too quickly. So you just kind of reword what that is and how it works.
Okay, yeah. So it came from the um, if I'm remembering the history of the research literature, like a lot of this is before I even got into science, but it came from the observation that gay males on average tend to have more older brothers and tend to come from larger families
Hmm.
than straight males, all else being equal. And again, this is like statistical averages. It's not true for everyone.
Yeah.
Um, and so the question is like, well, okay, why, what is it about having more older brothers that increases your likelihood of being gay? And perhaps the simplest explanation is that um, for any given pregnancy, if the fetus is male, that just seems to increase the likelihood that the next fetus, if it's male, is going to be gay. And and so that's basically what the fraternal birth order effect is. It's just the idea that um, a pregnancy with a male fetus increases the likelihood that a future pregnancy with a male fetus is going to produce someone who's gay.
Hmm.
And and so yeah, I think the strongest, well, at least the motivating evidence for that hypothesis was that observation that gay males tend to have more older brothers,
Hmm.
and uh, that uh, so like one of the sources of um, well, there's different. Uh, sorry, I think it might be a topic that's complicated enough that we maybe don't want to spend a lot of time on it
Yeah.
because like there's a whole bunch of possible reasons that sort of come together and like there's a phenomenon called microchimerism where um, uh, women who have been pregnant have been observed to have like really trace amounts of Y chromosome uh,
Yes.
and
Cells inside
and
the
and so
body.
like
Mm.
right, yeah, so like there's an exchange of tissue and DNA in between the mother and fetus. And so like there could even be multiple different possible ways in which a pregnancy can influence the outcome of future pregnancies.
Yeah.
And and so like I mentioned the Y chromosome linked histocompatibility complex and the idea that the mother's immune system is being primed to influence the sexual orientation of the younger brother if she's been pregnant with an older brother with older brothers in the past. That's one possible explanation, and that could even be a contributor um, alongside other explanations.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. So okay, so we've talked about the basically the non-genetic. This is an issue with or it's caused by the mother's reaction to having multiple sons. Um,
Mhm.
let's talk about some genetic causes for this. So there could be actual adaptive genetic causes like kin selection, and there could just be non-adaptive consequences of multiple genes interacting. Maybe we should explore that idea.
Yeah, sure. So there, there's like I said, there's several different, over a dozen possible explanations that have been proposed in the literature for same-sex behavior. As far as like homosexuality as an orientation in humans, from what I've seen of the literature, the most uh, preferred or like the leading candidate explanations are kin selection, and then what one of your commenters referred to as, I believe they referred to it as like intra-locus conflict,
Mm-hmm.
or what's often referred to in the literature as sexually antagonistic selection or sexual antagonism.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea with sexual antagonism is that it refers to uh, again, we're kind of getting into like that issue of potentially using confusing language, because like a lot of anthropomorphic language is
Yeah.
used like in biology, but in this context, the antagonism doesn't refer to like the behavior of the organism. It refers to the effects of the genetic components. And so a gene or a set of genes could have uh, conflicting effects depending on the sex of the individual that inherits those genes. And that would be the example of sexual antagonism.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of really, really fascinating examples that actually have nothing to do with um, sexual orientation per se, but make it easier to kind of understand the general concept. And one of those would be uh, genetic traits that are inherited maternally. So, like, for example, mitochondrial DNA, or
Mm-hmm.
in some species, there are bacterial reproductive parasites, like in arthropods, especially many, many species of insect have this bacterial parasite called Wolbachia. And it's
Mm-hmm.
a reproductive parasite that is inherited maternally, just like, mitochondria are. And because it's inherited maternally, it represents the male germline represents an evolutionary dead end. It's only being passed by females from one generation to the next.
Okay.
And so if a mutation were to happen that has a uh, a a benefit to the reproductive fitness of females, well, it doesn't really matter if, as a byproduct, it is deleterious to the reproductive fitness of males, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be an example of sexual antagonism. And in the case of that Wolbachia species, one of the effects that have been observed is the feminization of males. There's also male sterility, or uh, uh, what do you call it? There's another one of them is parthenogenesis, right,
Yeah.
where females can reproduce without even needing males. And so like the Wolbachia can there's male lethality where they can just kill males, but as long as it doesn't harm females, the Wolbachia parasite doesn't care.
Yeah.
And in some cases mitochondria can behave similarly, and the phenomenon is called the mother's curse, right? Where a mutation might have deleterious effects in males, but because mitochondrial DNA is maternally inherited, the mitochondria don't care if it hurts the males. And so by a similar token, the genetics of homosexuality could look something like the following, where the actual primary effect that is being favored by natural selection is that there's some genetic trait, or some combination of genetic factors that lead to increased birth rates among heterosexual women.
Mm-hmm.
And then as a byproduct, the male relatives of those heterosexual women tend to be, on average, more likely to be gay.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the pieces of evidence for that is that we actually do see, again, like on a population-wide statistical average, this isn't true in every case, but like if we're just talking in terms of like statistical averages across the population, we do tend to see elevated birth rates among the female relatives of homosexual males.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a piece of evidence that is very strongly in favor of this sexual antagonism hypothesis. And so there's this finding of like elevated birth rates, or elevated fecundity among the relatives of homosexual males, is something that has been reproducibly shown in multiple studies. In fact, most of the studies, I believe, that I shared in that original Twitter thread is like study after study where they're
Yeah.
like, yes, we see this effect. We see that on average, homosexual males tend to come from large families. They tend to have more brothers. They also tend to be related to women who experience or exhibit higher birth rates than the rest of the population on average. And so this is some of the evidence that weighs very strongly in favor of that sexual antagonism uh, effect being one of the key, if not the key, evolutionary explanation. It is at least one of the leading candidate explanations in the literature for male homosexuality. And like I said, female homosexuality has been studied a lot less, but there is some supporting evidence for that as well. In fact, there's a paper, one of the papers that I shared in that thread, uh, I believe it was titled "Possible Balancing Selection
Yeah.
in Female Homosexuality." And they see a very similar trend where homosexual women on average tend to be related to people who have higher birth rates than average.
Yeah.
And so that could be like some balancing effect where the genetic traits are leading to higher birth rates, which is the increase in evolutionary fitness that favors those genetic traits. And then the byproduct is that in some people, it increases the likelihood of homosexuality.
Yeah. I think so. The important and kind of tricky thing for people to understand under underneath these arguments for the genetic cause, the persistence of genes that can cause homosexuality, is you really have to take a gene's eye view of this, and it's the genes are the things that are surviving in the population. So specific types of genes, and a a handful, you can have multiple genes that together, when those are in a female, help her to be have lots of babies. It could affect her behavior in some way. It could affect how attracted she is to men. It could affect how interested she is in having babies, right? And when that same combination of genes ends up in a male, it might cause homosexuality. So because you have such a fitness gain when that combination exists in a female, uh, those genes will persist in a population, even though every once in a while it will produce a homosexual male who has far fewer offspring than his heterosexual peers. So you can get this to persist in a population over a long period of time, and that's really important because it's important to understand that those dynamics can exist. Because if you just think that there's a gay gene and it's just normal Mendelian genetics of a single trait, we would expect that if homosexual men have fewer children than heterosexual men, which it's not necessarily the case, but it turns out that because homosexual men can have heterosexual relationships, and they can father children anyways, but does turn out. I was looking at the stats for this, and it's um, even when there was cultural pressure for gay men to get married, they were still having far fewer children in the United States. Um, the stats were kind of confusing for me. Like their study was a little bit complicated, but the numbers were pretty clear that homosexuality was reducing um, number of offspring for men, even in cultures where they were pressured to get married anyways. And so you have, if this were just one gene, Mendelian sorting, we would expect it to disappear really quickly. But if it's multiple genes that are having different effects in females than they are in males, this could persist forever. There's no selection pressure that could. We wouldn't expect selection pressures to get rid of it if the mothers that have these traits are having more offspring. So
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that explanation of sexual antagonistic effects has been looked at in a number of different ways. There's one paper I'd be happy to share. In fact, it's in the original Twitter thread
yeah,
where they took like an evolutionary modeling approach. They basically did like an evolutionary simulation to say, uh, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that that is the explanation that male homosexuality hangs around as an evolutionary byproduct because the underlying genetic factors are leading to increased reproductive fitness among their relatives.
hmm
You know, there's some research has looked at that in a modeling way where they run an evolutionary simulation and say, okay, yes, under a certain range of conditions, I believe um, what they found, if I'm remembering the paper correctly, was that um, as long as there's at least two genomic loci and one of them is on the X chromosome, then yes, this is a sufficient evolutionary explanation to explain the persistence of male homosexuality. They've also seen this in, like I mentioned, a number of different empirical studies where they just look at birth rates among the relatives of homosexual males. And then finally, they've also looked at this in other species. Like, for example, one of the most widely used laboratory organisms is fruit flies, right?
Right.
And believe it or not, fruit flies are also observed to engage in, well, they engage in courtship behavior, but one of the types of courtship behavior is male-male courtship behavior, basically,
Hmm.
homosexual courtship. And there was one study, I don't think I shared it in the original Twitter thread because I was focusing on humans, but this one study also found that among individuals who are prone to elevated rates of male-male courtship, their relatives also have increased reproductive fitness. And so we've seen in fruit flies
Hmm.
a pattern that is consistent with the data we've seen in humans and the data that we've seen in evolutionary modeling. And they all seem to agree that yes, this is something that can explain the existence of male homosexuality.
Yeah.
And then of course there's at least one paper by I believe it was by Andrea Camperio-Chiani, and I hope I'm not butchering that name. I've only seen it written, so like some of the names in the literature I don't know if I'm pronouncing correctly, uh, but uh, uh, Andrea Camperio Chiani has done a lot of research on homosexuality, and one of the papers from 2017 finds a similar trend in the case of female homosexuality. And
Hmm.
so there's a lot of work left to kind of fill in the gap that's missing in terms of the data to explain female homosexuality. There's kind of a sexist bias in the research literature,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But from what little data we have seen so far, it does seem to be that there may be, or I would say even likely is, a similar explanation for homosexuality, regardless of which sex you're looking at.
Yeah. So I might have actually overcomplicated things when I was trying to summarize this a second ago because I guess even if you do have one gene that's causing the trait, if that one gene, when in a female, causes her to have far more children than the average female, but when in males sometimes causes them to be homosexual, then it would be selected for. I mean, natural selection would be promoting it because it's the math works out so that, well, still you're having more kids overall. Like this gene, on average, causes the host to have more offspring, even though it takes a hit every several generations because it ends up in a male that's now homosexual and is not as reproductive. So you could actually have that as a single gene causing that. Um, but have has there been research on specific alleles? Like, do we have a list of alleles that are associated with homosexuality? Like, where they've found this point mutation and this point mutation is linked to homosexuality?
Yeah, so they have at least to a limited extent. I mentioned that there are some genome-wide association studies,
Yeah.
and so to like as a real hopefully simple enough overview that doesn't complicate it too much. Um, a genome-wide association study is a type of study where you look at a really large number of people in the population that all have something in common, right? This could be uh, high blood pressure, or in our case, it could be, sexual orientation or alcoholism. You look at a really large number of people in the population that all have something in common, uh, and this is often favored for really complex traits where it's not super easy to figure out what's the mechanism causing this, right? Because
Hmm.
things like whether it's a risk of developing a certain type of disorder, or whether it's um, something like blood pressure or some other metabolic uh, factor like cholesterol or sexual orientation, these, or even various other personality traits. These are all complex traits that are likely the result of a culmination of multiple different genetic factors.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways of trying to figure out, well, what are those genetic factors, is to take a really large number of people from the population and then basically look at the how their DNA varies,
Hmm.
and if there is a genetic component, then what you'll see out of all that data, and the data is generally going to be some sort of like sequencing data,
Yeah.
or there's specific experimental strategies that you can implement to identify like what are the mutations that vary from person to person. These would be called single nucleotide polymorphisms. It
Right.
just means that a single nucleotide within the DNA is polymorphic, or that it varies from person to person. And so there's generally going to be some sort of large amount of genetic data that allows us to see how does the DNA sequence vary from person to person, and then we can compare people that all have a certain type of trait that we're interested in common, and then compare it to some other group that doesn't have that trait. So, for example, we could compare gay people to straight people, or people with high blood pressure to low blood pressure,
Hmm.
and any genetic components that are playing a role in determining that trait, we're going to see some we're going to expect to see some statistical correlation where, you know, people that have, let's say, within the DNA sequence on a certain chromosome at a certain location, like in a certain gene, maybe the nucleotide at that position is an A or an adenine, uh, and maybe it's much statistically less likely that it's an A in someone else who doesn't have that trait, right? So
Right.
you're just looking at statistical correlations at the DNA level. And using that type of approach, there have been at least a couple of studies that have found that yes, there are genetic variations within the human DNA, within the human genome, that vary from person to person in a way that is very highly statistically correlated with sexual orientation.
Yeah.
And that doesn't tell us like mechanistically all the details of what's going on, like how does the information in the DNA translate to a trait as complicated as human sexual attraction,
Right.
right? There's a lot of details left to fill in, but at the very least, we do see very strong statistical evidence in the DNA that there is a genetic component.
Yeah. Um, I got a question from Infinite Monkey.
Yeah, sure.
It says, "Can you dumb it down for us non-biologists? It sounds like you're saying it's a genetic byproduct." So, um, I think that question is about the earlier explanation. So when
Right. The sexual
yeah,
antagonistic hypothesis.
yeah, so instead of homosexuality being selected for by natural selection, and that's why it's sticking around, it's it the trait that those genes code for when in a female can increase her ability to have children in some way. Maybe they're making her desire to have more children. Maybe they're making her more sexually active. And when that same gene that can make a mother more reproductively successful ends up in a male, it can, in some cases, cause homosexuality. So it's it's not being directly selected for. Homosexuality is not being selected for, but that gene that causes it is being selected for in a different context. I I don't
Right.
know if I clarified that or if that was also hard to follow, but
Yeah, no, I mean that makes perfect sense. I suppose if you could indulge me for a second, it might help make sense um, to a wider audience to look at it in the following way.
yeah.
One point I actually really wanted to really emphasize in this conversation was the idea that uh, I think everyone kind of has like a at least a basic understanding of how natural selection works, right?
Yeah.
But the point that I really wanted to emphasize that gets back to to your point and to the listener's question, is that uh, not every like entity within a gene pool, or not every entity within a population needs to have its own offspring in order for that population to flourish, right? Like, so I mentioned a little while ago earlier in the conversation that mitochondrial DNA faces an evolutionary dead end in males, right? Because mitochondrial DNA is maternally inherited.
Yeah.
And yet the sperm still has mitochondria because it needs to produce energy so that the sperm can swim around, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a biological function that's being served there, even though it's an evolutionary dead end, right? And so I guess in that case, I just wanted to make the point that like not every entity needs to have its own descendants in order for the overall population to flourish.
Hmm.
You know, other examples would be like the somatic tissue, right? Like the um, the nerve cells and the muscle cells in our bodies, you know, they don't produce their own or sorry, they don't contribute their own DNA to the next generation, right?
Right.
It's the genetics for making like a muscle cell or a nerve cell are inherited through the sperm and the egg. They're not inherited directly from nerve and muscle cells,
Right.
right? And so you know, to scale up from like a molecular or cellular level to an animal behavior level, you mentioned the example of like bees and ants. Um, you know, obviously, if we look at that at various highly social animal societies like bees and ants and termites or naked mole rats, you know, some members of the population are very reproductively active. Other members of the population help in some other way, you know, gathering
Hmm.
resources or contributing in some other way towards the reproductive fitness of the members of the population that reproduce.
Yeah.
And so I think the really general point that I really want to emphasize is that not every member of a population needs to pass its DNA on to the next generation in order for the population to flourish, right? Because
Yeah.
it's possible to have indirect benefits. And so in the case of homosexuality, you know, the idea here is that you have a set of genetic factors that positively contribute to reproductive proliferation in some members of the population. And then in other members of the same population, it contributes to homosexuality.
Yeah.
And it's the overall combination of effects of those genetic factors that are being favored by natural selection. Uh, you know, and so that's I think the main point. And
Yeah.
so in a way, even though kin selection and the sexual antagonism hypothesis, where kin selection is that, you know, gay and bisexual people are kind of like helpers in the nest, you know, kind of like the sterile worker bees, so to
Yeah.
speak, of the human population. And then the sexual antagonism hypothesis is that homosexuality is like a kind of a byproduct, so to speak, of um, genetic factors that increase reproductive birth rates among relatives. You know,
Yeah.
and one thing that these both have in common is that more general point that not every member of a population needs to pass on its DNA for the population to flourish, right? Because there could be indirect effects that lead to homosexuality and direct effects that are favored by natural selection, and everything gets passed on, you know, across the population at a net level or as a net consequence.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I want to try and rephrase this one more time because it does look like I'm looking at the comments and yeah, this concept is a little bit confusing. So
Okay.
we have kin when we're talking about kin selection, which is what favors like worker bees that don't ever reproduce. That is an actual adaptation. The everyone's better off in a bee population if some individuals are devoted specifically to work in the hive. That is an adaptation. So you actually have natural selection that is selecting for actively selecting for individuals that will not reproduce. That's one explanation for homosexuality as well. Maybe in ancient tribal or traditional tribal settings, it was beneficial to have individuals who just decided not to reproduce, and all of their energy they would still produce food like everybody else did. They would still hunt like everybody else did. They would still do chores within the tribe like everyone else did, and so you get a net gain of reproductive fitness for that lineage, just like you do in bees. So that's one explanation for homosexuality. It's actually adaptive. The other explanation for homosexuality is that it's a byproduct. You have a gene that's really successful in a female, and in males it can cause homosexuality. Well, if you have, let's say you have a mutation that causes females to be twice as productive in having offspring, when that gene is in a female, and it causes males to be half as productive when it's in them. Well, that's the same as having no mutation at all. It's neutral, right? Um,
Yeah, it balances out.
yeah, it just balances out. It's just that when it happens to be in a male, they're not going to reproduce very much. When it happens to be in a female, they're going to reproduce a lot. So if you just do the math, it works out to be exactly the same. And that's how we would explain homosexuality as a byproduct of a gene that works really well in females, right?
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully that's clear now.
And
And
even if we do view it as a byproduct, um,
right,
that's not mutually exclusive with like other explanations. And
yes,
the point here is that let's say, for the sake of argument, that that explanation, which again, that's the one that, as far as I can see from the literature, seems to have the most evidence. Um, let's say that that's the case, right? That
yeah,
you have a set of genetic factors that increase birth rates among some people, and then it increases the likelihood of being gay among their closely related relatives,
yeah,
and then everything balances out, and that's why homosexuality persists. Uh, Under that situation, though, even though gay people are less likely on average to reproduce on their, for themselves or to have their own kids, um, they can still contribute to society in other ways, right? So that they
yeah,
can still, even without having to rely on the kin selection explanation per se, people have, complex animal societies like bees and ants, as well as humans, all have in common the tendency to form divisions of labor, right? And that's
yeah,
one of the ways that we flourish so well, right? And so
yeah,
uh, it could very well be that there's a combination of different explanations. In fact, that seems to be the case, that we need multiple different hypotheses to be true in order to account for all the data we see.
yeah,
Um, and
yeah,
and and so one of those explanations is that, like, yeah, even if we take homosexuality as a byproduct of genetic traits that increase birth rates among their relatives, well, then, that doesn't rule out kin selection. It doesn't rule out people who are gay and bisexual who don't have their own kids,
yeah,
contributing to the flourishing of society in other ways.
right. I I feel like the but it's worth pointing out that it's really difficult for us to tell whether or not homosexuality is an adaptation, a kin selected adaptation, versus a byproduct, because right now this all of the societies that we live in are so different from the societies that existed in the past. Um, it's not clear to me how quickly our genes could respond. Like, let's suppose, for example, that just for the sake of argument, that homosexuality is kin selection, and it evolved in small tribal groups. Well, now we would live in a society that works completely different. We use money, so there's no more like in a tribe. There's kind of it's tit for tat behaviors. You help other members of your group because they've been helping you, and you form these personal relationships, these strong reputations. Now we use money as a symbol instead of these reputations to decide who gets the goods that were produced by the group. So we quickly switched how everything works, and it's really hard for us to even study this, like the adaptive nature of homosexuality in modern culture, because modern culture is so dramatically different from the culture where this likely would have evolved in. So
Right.
I think that the cleanest explanation because of that is uh, that this is a byproduct, right, rather than kin selection. But I have seen quite a few people. I know Wilson, the
E.O. Wilson?
E.O. Wilson, he proposed homosexuality as being a kin selected trait in humans. Um, and so a lot of deep thinking biologists have proposed that, but it's very hard to prove. um, and so we got off topic a little bit because we were talking about actual actual observed mutations that are associated with homosexuality. Uh, my understanding of these trying to trying to link a mutation to a specific trait in humans, my understanding is that uh, it's incredibly difficult unless it's super obvious. So there are certain things like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and we really understand the mutation that causes that. Dwarfism, uh, is that the official word for it? I I forget there's like two different types of mutation that can cause dwarfism in humans. There's several others that cause it commonly in dogs and so on. Like these things we've been able to pinpoint because the effect is so dramatic, and in these cases, like a gene whose function we understand is completely broken. Like that gene just breaks. In the case of dwarfism in dogs, there's a duplication of a gene that causes the long bones to fuse too early. Because we understand the genetics well enough and exactly what they do, we can say that is the cause for this trait. But in most cases, that's nearly impossible to do because we don't understand enough about the link between genotype and phenotype. Uh, how confident are you in these types of or what is the confidence among scientists about these correlations between these specific genetic markers and homosexuality? Is it strong or is it weak?
Right. Okay. So the statistical correlations from like genome-wide association studies, at least the few that I've seen, and again, I can share the papers that
Yeah.
I'm referencing here, show a strong statistical correlation for some loci, some locations within the human genome.
Hmm.
Uh, Now, going all the way back, almost 30 years now, going back to like the early 90s, um, it's been shown at least by a few different studies. In fact, this is one of the genetic factors contributing to male homosexuality has most reproducibly been uh, linked to the X chromosome, and not only the X chromosome, but a specific region of the X chromosome that's very close to the end of the chromosome on, I believe it's the long arm. It's the XQ28 region of the X chromosome. So like it's just
Okay.
one little region of the X chromosome that's close to the end of the chromosome. It's called the subtelomeric region because like telomeres are like the little
End
you can almost
caps.
think of them as the caps, like the little plastic caps on the end of your shoelaces. It's
Yeah.
like that,
Yep.
but for chromosomes.
Hmm.
Um, and within this region of the X chromosome, there there seems to be something going on that is being statistically linked to homosexuality, and this is a finding that's been shown in multiple studies. Um, and then also chromosome 8, and and then there's a few other scattered across the human genome. There's a few other loci that have been shown to be statistically correlated with homosexuality.
Yeah.
Now, as far as like what's the like uh, what's the missing piece of the story that says, okay, here's some genetic factors, and then over here is homosexuality. What's going on in between that causes the DNA to be expressed in a way that contributes to homosexuality. There is at least one study I can think of, and this is again one of the ones that I shared in the Twitter thread, where uh, after the genome-wide association study that I mentioned was done, that found that certain regions of the DNA are statistically correlated with homosexuality, there was actually a follow-up study that said that for these genetic factors that are correlated with homosexuality, they also happen to be correlated with a tendency among heterosexual people to have a larger number of sex partners.
Okay.
And and so there's a correlation that goes in both directions. On one hand, you have there's a set of genetic factors, and on one hand, you have a statistical correlation with the likelihood of being homosexual, and on the other hand, for those who are not homosexual but still have the same genetic factors, there's a statistical correlation with the likelihood of having more sex partners.
Hmm.
And so this is again one of those additional pieces of evidence that seems to show that the genetic factors that contribute to a likelihood of homosexuality also contribute to a likelihood of higher birth rates
Yeah.
among relatives. And you mentioned that like one of the possible ways to explain that is like a behavioral phenomenon. Perhaps the genetic factors are leading to like just being more attracted to males. Okay, and
Right.
then maybe that just makes heterosexual women, more sexually active, and then it makes men more likely to be gay.
Right.
Um, that has been proposed as an explanation. I just want to point out that that's not like the only explanation. There's been one study from about 10 years ago that also found that the the female relatives of homosexual men also on average had fewer gynecological disorders and fewer pregnancy complications. So there
Mm.
could be like physiological
Yeah.
as in addition to or perhaps even instead of behavioral explanations, but the underlying evolutionary explanation would be the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Just the numbers shake out so that it's, even though it'll cause homosexuality every so often, it's its benefits. And when I say benefit, I mean I'm just talking about reproductive benefits far outweigh that. So yeah,
Right.
that's really interesting. What I'm finding is that I'm kind of uncomfortable talking about this because I don't want to say something that sounds like when I talk about like beneficial or the cost. There's something can be beneficial for evolution, but also can be like unpleasant socially, and vice versa. Something can be a problem as far as spreading your genes goes, but can actually cause an individual to live a much more uh, pleasurable life or satisfying life. So it's I do want to be clear with that. Like when we're talking about the evolution of these things, we're talking it. If a trait is good in evolutionary biology, that means that it helps increase reproductive fitness. If it's bad, it means that it reduces reproductive fitness. But that does not correlate to what we would actually think is good or bad in our lifetimes. It's good for a female praying mantis to eat the head of its lover because she's going to have more babies. But if that's the thing that people were doing, we would say that that's bad, and we would want to stop that from happening. So there's not. You're talking about the what the Malthusian the language here gets
Yeah.
a little bit complicated.
Right. Yeah. And you might have noticed from my uh, you mentioned that you've looked at my graduate work when I was getting my PhD, and like one
Yeah.
of the things that really interested me during graduate school, and an interest I've continued to hold, is the phenomenon of cooperation, right?
Yeah.
And like the sort of the duality between cooperation and conflict. And the reason I bring that up is because like on one hand, I agree with your point that like a trait that maybe is beneficial from the point of view of evolution is perhaps not beneficial from the point of view of a person that has that trait,
Mm-hmm.
or vice versa. However, on the other hand, I guess I want to like emphasize that like one of the reasons for the evolutionary flourishing of us and many other species of animal is a tendency to cooperate and work together for the common good, right? And
Mm-hmm.
uh, and that's you know basically a major component of the explanation for kin selection, right? Is that
Yeah.
some genes are more easily passed on to future generations, specifically because animals are working together and helping each other survive, right? And so, in that sense, there's some level at which I think the distinction between what's good from our own point of view and what's good from an evolutionary point of view, that distinction can break down in some respects, and it specifically breaks down, I think, in the context of like one of the things that's in our benefit, both evolutionarily and personally, is working together and forming cooperative interactions, basically mutually
Right.
beneficial cooperative interactions.
Right. Well, one of the examples of a trait, an evolved trait that's being selected for, that's actually really traumatic for the organisms that possess it is in dogs when they mate the the erectile tissue in the male dog inflates so much that they can't separate afterwards. They're stuck together. So I've noticed a lot of Americans don't know this, but if you go to South America, you go anywhere where there's a lot of wild, but stray dogs, you'll see it all the time. There's those two dogs are stuck to each other. That's weird. And like our dogs, when they mate, they fight afterwards. So they're stuck together. And then, so Zoe, my female, she'll get angry at him for being stuck inside of her, and she'll fight him, and she'll knock him over. I mean, it's brutal. Like it's really brutal. And one of the reasons that we think that this evolved is because there's so much mate guarding in dogs. When you have a female who is she thinks that she's the one that's supposed to be reproducing and the other females are not. When she sees other pairs mating in the group, she will break them up. She'll try and rip them apart. And we think that this evolved so that she couldn't do that. So the
I see.
it's an extremely unpleasant trait. It can cause serious injuries in the male, actually in the male and the female, but it evolved because it helps reproduction. So you can get the evolution of these traits that are unpleasant for individuals and vice versa. But yeah, that's a little bit of a tangent here.
I think a good example in humans is has to do with the evolution of pregnancy, right? And like there's definitely like almost like a evolution kind of has to like thread the needle between, as humans have evolved, culture and tool making, we we have a larger cerebral cortex than like our closest relatives in the form of chimpanzees and bonobos, and that can potentially lead to pregnancy complications.
Right.
And right, so like just like you mentioned, there's similar parallels, not the same exact example that you mentioned, but there are evolutionarily similar parallels in us.
Mm-hmm. We've got a couple of questions that have been building up here, and
Okay.
we're at 350. I don't want to cut you off though. So, did we discuss most of the things that you wanted to discuss?
Yeah, I think so. I think the main point I wanted to hit was like if all the details get lost or you don't remember, I think the main point is that like not every member in a population needs to reproduce in order for the population to flourish, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like it's just I think that's an important point to keep in mind, because it's often argued, at least in my experience, people often argue that like homosexuality is unnatural and it should be discouraged because it's a form of like or because like homosexual sex doesn't lead to reproduction.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, so what? That doesn't mean that it's unnatural, because we see examples all across the different levels of biological organization, from cellular to animal society, and in many different contexts where individuals within a population can flourish just fine, and the population itself can flourish just fine because of a reproductive division of labor where some members are reproducing and others aren't, and that's, evolution can favor that very easily.
Yeah.
I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Right. Yeah. So it really that when people have an evolutionary issue with homosexuality, it comes from just having an overly simplified idea of how natural selection works. You can get selection to favor individuals who are not reproductively active.
Exactly.
Let's do. Okay, it's 3:52 here. So what time is it over there?
It's 3:52 here.
Okay. Let's do. Oh yeah, you're. Sorry, I thought you were in California, but yeah, you're in New York, right?
Right. Yeah.
How much time do you have to answer a couple of questions here?
Oh, I'm good. However
Okay.
long it takes.
Okay. Let's see. YouTuber The Higher Evolution did a super chat. Thank you. I appreciate that. If I'm trying to go through here and just look at questions, but I'm kind of a slow reader when I'm
Okay.
broadcasting. So for people who, if you put your questions earlier in the chat, just paste them again so I can see them. But we've got, let's see. Max McCafel asks, "What are my other questions? How do those human studies account for oppression and discrimination in populations? We're only studying the out, self-identified gay individuals. Seems like a potential bias." Um, I guess that's about these questions, these studies. Like, how do we know that we're actually studying and getting the true numbers of homosexual, um, like how common it is if these societies are oppressing homosexuality, therefore people are going to be shy to talk about it.
Right. Yeah. That's actually a really excellent point. And it's one of the reasons why in some societies we have very limited data on the prevalence of homosexuality and bisexuality, right? Like there's still to this day, for some reason, we have societies where it's illegal for people of the same sex to have, physical intimacy.
Right.
And so in a society like that, if you wanted to do a study on the prevalence of homosexuality, you're going to be hard pressed to be able to recruit participants in that study.
Yeah.
And so the question, the person that asked this question brings up an excellent point, and that is a very serious problem. I completely agree. Um, that being said, though, so there is still, I would say, uh, a couple of things in favor of some of the data we're seeing. Like the problem of the data being very limited, I think, is really just a problem of being able to. Well, I mean, it leads to a problem, I should say, of being able to um, have the amount of data that we would need to really be able to put some of these questions to rest in terms of like what are the different evolutionary explanations that are perhaps most relevant in contributing to the prevalence and the persistence of homosexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but from the data that we have seen, some of the uh, explanations that we have, like for example, the explanation that we've talked about most here in terms of uh, homosexuality being genetically linked to elevated birth rates among the the relatives of gay and bisexual people. That type of explanation has data that supports it that comes from independent studies of people in different societies. And
Mm-hmm.
so like, yeah, even though the data is very limited and we would very much like to have more data and in order to get that, of course, we would very much need to have, you know, perhaps uh, a more favorable and a more welcoming culture to the LGBTQ community. And this is, like I said, is especially true in many societies where it's culturally frowned upon or it's
Right.
illegal and it's more heavily discriminated against. Um, but so on one hand, like I think the question asker makes a really excellent point, but on the other hand, I don't think that it is a problem in terms of like casting doubt on the what we see to be the leading explanations because we do still see like a consistent reproducible effect of the type of data that is supportive of that explanation for homosexuality has been reproducibly like it's reproducibly shown up in the literature.
Yeah.
And so I would still say that like yeah the evidence that we have strongly supports the leading hypotheses. Nevertheless, yes, the it's tragically the case that we have very
Yeah.
limited data still.
Yeah. So even with the data that we have, we see that there's a very clear signal here, and of
That's right.
course it must be higher than reported in some countries. Like if you were to go to a country where you're executed for homosexual behavior, obviously people are not going to want to participate in that study, right? Or you're going to get less
Right,
people
yeah.
being open. Uh, we've got a question that I think was asked in total sincerity, but some people might find this offensive, and so I do think we should just talk about this. Uh, the question of whether or not homosexuality is a disorder, a neurological disorder. And this is interesting. It actually has very little to do with evolutionary biology, but it has to do with how people classify things. Homosexuality was classified in the past as a psychological disorder, and that was changed, I believe, like in the 70s, because this really is a what do humans who are in charge of medical science textbooks want to decide to call this, right? I don't know
Right.
if you know much of the history on that or.
A little bit. So I'll go ahead and start with the caveat that I'm not a mental health expert by any means.
Mhm,
And in fact, I'm not a researcher on sexual orientation, right? My field is more general evolutionary biology and evolutionary theory.
mhm,
Um, that being said, though, like you mentioned, it's been almost 50 years now since the American Psychiatric Association stopped referring to uh, homosexuality as a mental disorder.
mhm,
And a big part of the reason for that is that um, there are like specific sets of diagnostic criteria that, irrespective of the how a disorder manifests, like there are different types of mental disorders that people can have, irrespective of the specifics of how those mental disorders are different from each other. They nevertheless there's nevertheless is a like set of diagnostic criteria in terms of like a person's ability to like function, basically, so to
mhm.
speak, like hold down a job, and maintain healthy relationships with other people, for example.
Right.
And so again, I'm not a mental health expert, but I do know that I can say confidently that like there's specific criteria that have to be met in order to be able to say that yes, this is a mental disorder. And that's the case when we're not speaking specifically about sexual orientation, like when we're just talking about mental health in general.
Yeah.
And then as we began to understand sexual orientation um, like more thoroughly, because like the research on sexual orientation really started to ramp up in like the 60s and 70s and 80s. And as we started to get more data and more information about homosexuality, it became clear that homosexuality, same-sex attraction, and a tendency to have same-sex relationships, it really doesn't meet any of those diagnostic criteria of
Mhm,
mental illness. And uh, a lot of the traits or qualities of gay people that do meet those diagnostic criteria can be attributed to other things. Like, for example, gay people, uh, you gay and bisexual people in general I'm sorry, I should back up. The LGBTQ community entirely. I know we haven't been talking about like gender identity, but
yeah.
across the board, the LGBTQ community in general has elevated rates of things like tendency for suicide and substance abuse and um, depression and anxiety, and
Mhm,
these very clearly do meet the at least in many cases for many people they do rise to the level of meeting diagnostic criteria for mental illness. But then at the same time, these traits can also be attributed to things like societal discrimination.
right.
And one of the things that's been seen in the literature is that the uh, the mental health outcomes of people who are gay and bisexual is uh, is something that is responsive to the surrounding society. So like
Yeah.
people who are gay and bisexual who live in places where society is more welcoming and more affirmative, and where like same-sex marriage is legal, for example, we see lower rates of like substance abuse and suicide and the other indicators of mental illness. And so I think that's really strong evidence that the aspects of or the qualities that are common among the LGBTQ community that meet the conditions of mental illness can't be attributed to uh, sexual orientation or gender identity per se. They have other societal causes. And so in that respect, I would say, yeah, it's basically outdated information to refer to homosexuality as a mental disorder. That's, that hasn't really been the case for over 50 years now, and the research has progressed. And as we've gotten more information, we have more clarity and more detail on what it is about the mental health of the LGBTQ community, and why, what are the causes of uh, you know, things that are risk factors to mental health. And it's not the sexual orientation itself; it's a whole bunch of other factors.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously in a homosexual relationship, you're not going to have kids. So you're not going to have kids if you only have sexual relations with your partner in a homosexual monogamous situation. So this is an example where we can consider something to be less evolutionarily fit than a heterosexual phenotype, right? But that's not the same as saying that it's a disorder, because you've got people that can live happy, wonderful, productive, healthy lives in homosexual relationships, homosexual pairs. So,
Right. Yeah. In fact, there's a lot of literature actually on parenting among LGBTQ people. Sorry, I'm getting off on
yeah.
a little bit
No,
of a
no,
tangent, but
that's
like
totally fine.
one of the I guess collections of literature that I've been building up is research on parenting outcomes, and like,
Mm-hmm.
consistently, study after study after study, it's reproducibly shown, like reliably reproducibly shown, that there's really no difference between same-sex couples and heterosexual couples when it comes to the long-term outcomes, like in terms of school performance or mental health outcomes, for example,
Of their
of the
children.
kids that they raise,
Yeah, the
of their
kids that they
children,
raise. Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So with adoption and so on. Yeah. Let's see. I'm looking at questions here. Infinite Monkey asks, it's a consistent percentage range in the data, right? So I think he's asking about the percentage of homosexual orientation is consistent, and yes, it seems to be cross culturally consistent. But of
Yeah, I mean, it
course,
varies from society to society, but the thing that is consistent is that it seems to be within a range, like,
yeah,
mid to upper single digits, like depending on the society you look at. I think it's higher like in the Philippines than it is in India, for example. But generally for most societies, somewhere between 3 and 11% are the numbers that are being reported in the research literature.
hmm let's see. I think that is all of the questions directly related to this research. We've got Rachel Light asks, curious if you guys have seen those two documentaries on the PBS YouTube channel. Sorry, I got to figure out which two you're talking about. Um, Two documentaries from PBS Science Channel on the possibility of the disappearing Y chromosome. I have not watched those. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I haven't seen the documentary. I've seen some talk in the literature of like the atrophy of the Y chromosome.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, in fact, I mean, some species of animal don't even have a Y chromosome. It's like, whether they're a male or not is just the presence or absence of a second copy of the X chromosome.
Right.
And and so, like, yeah, it doesn't really surprise me, but that's also, I can't really speak to the documentary or what's being claimed in them.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like over evolutionary time, the sex chromosome, uh, like the sex chromosome setups that influence an individual's sex, being male or female, those can like kind of like under the hood, things can swap out and change quite a bit over evolutionary time. And it's like on the Y chromosome, there's only a handful of genes that are really important on that chromosome, and sometimes those will end up on an X chromosome. So there's definitely possibilities that you could completely get rid of the Y chromosome and still have males and females in a population. It just
Exactly.
It
Yeah.
would take a long time. It's we don't
Right.
expect that to happen like in our lifetimes, but that could certainly
Right.
happen. That could happen, and it wouldn't. It would happen without disrupting the male female mating system if it
Right.
happens
Exactly.
step by step.
Yeah.
I believe that is all of the questions that we have. I'm gonna look
Okay.
over this one more time real quick just to make sure. But while I'm looking over this, do you want to just tell us any parting words, any
Um,
last thoughts on
well, I
this
don't know
topic?
if it's a good way to wrap up like the entirety of the conversation, but on that last point you mentioned, like um the like you I think you mentioned something about like the swapping of genetic information like between chromosomes.
Yeah,
And that's something that we definitely see in other contexts, right? Like I can't remember if we were already streaming live when I mentioned this point, but like the mitochondria are like the distant descendants of what were once free living bacteria.
yeah,
And, mitochondria have continued to retain their own DNA, but the mitochondrial genome has also been getting pared down in size, especially in animals. And like a lot of the genes that were once encoded by mitochondrial DNA have been translocated to the nucleus and are now encoded, the genes are expressed off of the nuclear genome, and then the proteins are synthesized by the ribosomes and then imported back into the mitochondria. And there's evolutionary reasons for why that it makes sense to do it that way, but nevertheless, like we see like a kind of an evolutionary pruning down of the size of the mitochondrial genome.
yeah.
And so that's just another example that kind of mirrors what's been suggested to be the case for the Y chromosome.
Hmm. Uh, the final question I was able to find in here was a question about twin studies. I guess we did kind of
Mm-hmm.
jump over this. Uh, what we see that there's if one identical twin is gay, the percent that the other one will be gay is higher than in uh, fraternal twins. So,
That's correct.
what do you know off the top of your head what that percentage is? How strong of a correlation that
Uh,
is?
I off the top of my head, I don't. I want to say it was in the mid double digits. I think it was like 30%, 40%
Yeah,
likelihood
yeah,
if one is gay that the other is going to be gay. But again, I don't quote me on that because
okay,
I'm going to have to consult the literature and make sure. But also, this is something that's been looked at like in multiple studies, and so you're going to see different um, like some variation from study to study
hmm,
on what that exact percentage is. The overall trend, though, that it is more likely to be the case for identical twins than fraternal twins. That part is consistently found, but the specific numbers are going to vary a little bit between studies.
yeah,
And the I guess one of the points that has been made in the past uh, that I think might be relevant to your listeners is that identical twins are sometimes uh, treated differently than fraternal twins. Like they might
hmm,
look more similarly, and that might affect the way they're raised. And so, even in the case of identical twins, some people might shrug that off and say, okay, well, it still doesn't prove that it's genetic. Um, and in fact, even twin studies in general, like people sometimes point to as evidence that homosexuality isn't genetic because, hey, look, here's a twin that's straight and here's a person that's straight and a twin that's gay. That prove that it's not genetic? And
hmm,
like, no, it's more complicated than that. And the strongest evidence that it's genetic, I would say it comes from like those genome-wide association studies. But again, like those are more recent and the older evidence from comparing, like you said, identical twins versus fraternal twins, that whether the twins are identical or fraternal, that affects the likelihood that they're going to share the same sexual orientation. And so,
hmm,
yeah, I would say that general trend is consistent in the literature, but the specific percentages are going to vary.
yeah, yeah. The percentage that he had seen was 30%. So
Okay, cool.
that's interesting. I am not familiar with those studies, but um, well, I guess yeah. Any final summary that you'd like to give as we wrap this up?
Um, yeah, so I guess the main 2 points that I mentioned, I think I mentioned like in private conversation that I wanted to hit was like that something being genetic doesn't mean that there's deterministic, you know, oh, this person has this gene, therefore they have this trait. Like
Mm-hmm.
genes interact with their environment, right? Like,
Yep.
we shouldn't think of it as a nature versus nurture debate. It's like we should be thinking of it in terms of trying to figure out, well, no, it's both, but how do nature and nurture interact? And
Mm-hmm.
it's in that interaction and the complexity of that interaction where we find the answers. And so that's the main point, is that like something being genetic doesn't mean genetic determinism is true. And then because environment plays a huge role. And then the other point is that uh, not every member of a population needs to reproduce, or needs to pass on its own DNA for the population to flourish. Because, the study of evolution, if it's proven anything, it's proven um, that a population can thrive on a reproductive division of labor, whereby the DNA gets passed on very successfully, specifically because there's a division of labor where some members reproduce and other members contribute to society in other ways. And homosexuality could very well be one of those ways, or sorry,
Mm-hmm.
one manifestation of that tendency. And again, sexual antagonism, where some members have elevated birth rates, and then the genetic traits that contribute to that also contribute to homosexuality among relatives. That's one perfect example of this more general point, where not everyone needs to reproduce for the
Yeah.
population to flourish.
Yeah. I guess now, if you want to look at that same argument from the gene's eye view, you could say that uh, a gene doesn't need every individual it ends up in to reproduce. It needs a certain percentage of them to reproduce in order to persist in the population. It just needs to be relevant compared to other versions of itself. It needs to be able to compete with them, but that doesn't require making every single person it's in reproduce. It can make some reproduce extra and others reproduce not at all, and that
Exactly.
extra will allow it to persist. So,
Exactly.
well, thanks. This was a lot of fun. I mean, this is just a topic it's difficult to talk about because of just all of the social it gets political and so on. But
Yeah.
this was really fun to just look at the data and talk about this. Again, this is a question that I get a lot, and I just don't really know how to deal with it. So I'm really glad you came on to help. I've got your Twitter is on screen right now. I'm gonna
Okay.
have links to your Twitter in the video description. I'm gonna have links to the papers that you send as well, so people can do some
Okay.
more reading on their own. But thank you, Bryan. I look forward to seeing what you publish in the future and how your research goes continuing forward.
Yeah.
So
Thanks. I appreciate you having me on. This has been a lot of fun.
cool. So long, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
All right. Thanks. That was fun.